On a quiet Saturday morning, I was having breakfast with my 10-year-old granddaughter when she suddenly stopped eating and whispered, "Grandpa, why are that woman and the little boy only drinking water? Aren't they hungry?" I turned toward the table behind me and froze. The woman looked up, and the moment our eyes met, all the color drained from her face. Everyone said you disappeared 3 years ago." She immediately grabbed my hand and whispered, "Please don't tell your son I'm alive. Don't tell him you saw us here." Then she told me the truth about my son, and what I heard sent a chill down my spine. Welcome, and if you are new here, subscribe to Revenge Dad right now, because this story is only getting started. Tell me, in the comments, what city or country are you joining us from today? I love knowing who is in this room with me. This story contains fictional elements included for depth and educational purpose. Names and locations are coincidental, but the lesson at the heart of it is one I hope stays. My name is Henry Calloway. I am 67 years old, and I have spent 4 decades building things meant to last. Bridges, foundations, structures designed to hold weight that most people never think about. I know how to read the invisible lines of stress in a steel beam. I know when something is about to give way long before it actually does. What I did not know on a Saturday morning in March was that the truth I had been living with for 3 years was about to collapse right there in a Brooklyn diner, brought down not by lawyers or investigators or any of the tools I would later use, but by a 10-year-old girl asking a perfectly simple question. Greystone Diner had been part of my Saturdays for longer than I could remember. The place sat on the corner of a quiet block in Carroll Gardens, its windows fogged on cold mornings, its booths worn smooth from years of use. The coffee was strong, the eggs were never fussy, and the staff knew my order before I opened my mouth. My granddaughter Sophie, my daughter Ellen's girl, 10 years old, and already more observant than most adults I knew, called it the good pancake place, which I considered high praise. That morning, Sophie had ordered the blueberry pancakes with extra syrup, and I had my usual black coffee, scrambled eggs, bacon, and wheat toast. We sat at the table closest to the window, the late winter sunlight coming in at a low angle and spreading across the worn tabletop. I had my back to the rest of the diner. That small, ordinary detail would matter more than I could have imagined. Sophie was cutting her pancakes into careful squares when she stopped. I noticed because the scraping of her fork went quiet, and Sophie was not a quiet child. "Grandpa," she said, I was reading the back of the laminated menu out of habit, the way you do when your mind is somewhere else. "Why do those people only have water?" They didn't order anything. I glanced up from the menu. Sophie was looking over my shoulder toward the tables behind me, her brow pulled together in the particular way she had when something did not make sense to her. "Maybe they're waiting for someone," I said. "They've been sitting there since before we sat down," Sophie said, "and the lady keeps looking at the door, not like she's waiting, more like she's watching." I turned around in my seat. There were 2 of them at the table by the far wall, a woman and a boy. The woman wore a faded olive green jacket, the kind that had been washed too many times. Her dark hair was cut short, much shorter than I remembered, and her face was drawn in a way that made her cheekbones sharp under the diner's overhead light. In front of them sat 2 glasses of water. No menus, no plates, no coffee. The boy was maybe 9 or 10. He was looking at Sophie's pancakes with the careful, practiced expression of someone who had taught himself not to show what he was feeling. When he sensed me turning, he dropped his eyes to the table immediately, his small shoulders pulling inward. My fork slipped from my fingers and rang against the edge of my plate, because I knew that woman's face. Even with the short hair, even with the hollowed-out look around her eyes. Even with 3 years and what appeared to be a very hard life written across every feature, I knew her. The way you know someone you once saw every Sunday at your own dinner table. The way you know someone whose wedding you attended, whose son you held as a newborn in the hospital. Her name was Claire Donovan Calloway, my son Marcus's wife. And the boy next to her, the boy who had just looked away from Sophie's pancakes with that heartbreaking, trained-in composure, was Ethan, my grandson, 10 years old. The last time I had seen him, he had been 7, gap-toothed and loud, running through my backyard in Queens on a summer afternoon. My chest tightened so fast, I had to grip the edge of the table. 3 years ago, Marcus had sat across from me in my living room, with his hands folded and his jaw set, and told me what Claire had done. He said she had stolen the proprietary design files for the Phoenix Bridge project, a $340 million infrastructure contract the most significant work Callaway Structural Engineering had ever taken on. He said she had transferred those files to a competitor through a contact named Daniel Mercer, that she had accepted over $118,000 in exchange, and that she had disappeared overnight, taking Ethan with her. I had believed him. I had been furious. I had said things I could not take back. And now Claire was sitting 12 feet behind me, with 2 glasses of water and no food in a diner she clearly had not chosen because it was convenient. I stood up. Claire saw me the moment I turned fully around. The color left her face so completely and so fast that I actually took a step forward, afraid she might faint. Her hand shot out and grabbed Ethan's wrist, and she was already pulling him toward the edge of the booth, her eyes sweeping toward the door with the quick calculating look of someone who had planned an exit before they ever walked in. "Claire," my voice came out lower than I intended, rougher. 3 years, everyone said you were gone." She froze, not because she felt safe. I could see that plainly. Her breathing was fast and shallow, and the hand gripping Ethan's wrist had gone white at the knuckles. "Please!" The word came out cracked, scraped raw. "Please just go back to your table. Claire, that's Ethan." My voice broke slightly on his name before I could stop it. "I know who he is." Her eyes were darting between my face and the door, calculating, measuring. "Please just go. Please, please just leave. Please." I took one more step toward her, keeping my voice as low and level as I could manage, though my heart was slamming against my ribs hard enough that I could feel it in my throat. "I'm not going to make a scene. I'm not going to call anyone. I just need you to—" "Don't." Her voice cracked on the word, and her eyes filled so fast it seemed to surprise even her. She blinked hard, pressing her lips together, fighting it down with the visible effort of someone who had gotten very good at not crying in public. "Don't call Marcus. Whatever you do right now, please do not call Marcus and tell him where we are." The words hit me somewhere behind the sternum and stayed there. Not "please don't be angry," not "I can explain," not "please give me a chance." Her first words to me after 3 years were a warning about my own son. Ethan had not moved. He was sitting very straight in the booth, his small hands flat on the table in front of him, watching me with dark, serious eyes that belonged on a much older face. He glanced once at Sophie, who had appeared at my elbow. At some point I had not even heard her cross the diner, and then he looked back at me with an expression that made my throat ache. He was not afraid of me exactly. He was braced, the way a child is braced when they have learned that the arrival of an adult often means something is about to change, and change is rarely good. "Okay," I said. I said it to Claire, but I was looking at Ethan. "Okay, nobody's calling anyone." I raised one hand toward the counter and caught the eye of a server I recognized. "Can we get 2 more orders over here, whatever they'd like?" Claire shook her head immediately. "We can't—" "It's breakfast," I said. My voice came out steady, which surprised me because nothing else in my body felt steady at all. "Just sit down, Claire, please." She looked at me for a long moment, her jaw tight, her eyes still bright with the tears she was refusing to let fall. Then she looked at Ethan, and Ethan looked at Sophie's pancakes. He did not reach for them. He did not ask. He simply looked quickly and carefully the way he had been looking this whole time, wanting something, and having already learned not to want it out loud. That look went through me like a cold wire. I pulled out the chair across from Claire and sat down because my legs had decided they were done holding me up. "Tell me," I said quietly, "what's going on?" Claire's hands were trembling on the edge of the table. She pressed them flat against the surface, trying to still them, and drew one careful breath. "Before I say anything," she said, her voice low and tight and stripped of everything except the bare words, "you have to promise me one thing." "What?" "Don't call Marcus." Her eyes held mine. "Not until you've heard everything. Whatever you think you know, whatever he told you, please. Don't call him until you've heard me." Outside, a bus rumbled past the window. The morning light shifted. At the counter behind me, I could hear Sophie quietly asking the server if the hot chocolate was made with real milk. I looked at Claire's hands still trembling against the table. "All right," I said. "I'm listening." The server, a young woman named Becca, whose name tag I had read 100 Saturday mornings, came over with a notepad and a practiced smile. "What can I get for you folks?" Claire's jaw tightened. She opened her mouth, and I could see the refusal already forming the same automatic response she had been running on for what I suspected was a very long time. Before she could say a word, I spoke first. "2 full breakfasts, please. Whatever the boy wants, pancakes, eggs, the works. and for her the same. "We have a special this morning," Becca offered cheerfully. "Buttermilk pancakes with bacon and home fries, comes with coffee or juice." I looked at Ethan. "What do you say, buddy? Pancakes sound good." Ethan's eyes moved from my face to his mother's. He was asking her permission without using a single word, and the precision of that small gesture, the way a 10-year-old had learned to check before wanting anything, made something behind my sternum pull tight like a wire being wound too far. Claire's throat moved as she swallowed. She gave the smallest nod. "Pancakes," Ethan said. His voice was quiet, careful. Then, after a beat, as if he had decided something, "Please." "Pancakes it is," Becca said, scribbling. "And for you, ma'am." "The same," Claire said. The word came out like it cost her something. After Becca walked away, I turned to Sophie, who had followed me across the diner, and was now standing at my elbow with her syrup-sticky fork still in her hand, studying Ethan with the frank, unhurried curiosity that only children can pull off without being rude. "Sophie," I said, "do you remember the big booth at the end of the counter? The one near the jukebox? The one with the spinning seats? That's the one. Why don't you take your plate down there and show Ethan how the seats spin? I think he'd like that." Sophie looked at Ethan. Ethan looked at Sophie. Something passed between them, with the wordless efficiency of children who have decided in the span of approximately 4 seconds that they are going to get along fine. "Do you want to?" Sophie asked him directly, ignoring all the adults entirely. Ethan looked at Claire once more. Claire nodded again, a little quicker this time, something loosening slightly around her eyes. "Okay," Ethan said. I watched the two of them carry their plates down to the far end of the counter, Sophie already chattering about something, Ethan listening, with that serious, attentive expression. When Sophie slid onto one of the spinning stools and demonstrated its full rotation, I saw the corner of Ethan's mouth pull upward just slightly, just for a second, and the tightness in my chest got worse, not better, because that small, almost smile looked exactly like a child, remembering that smiling was something he was allowed to do. I turned back to Claire. Up close in the full light of the diner, she looked worse than she had from across the room. The shadows under her eyes were deep enough to suggest she had not slept properly in longer than a few nights. Her hands, which she had placed flat on the table to stop them trembling, were not entirely succeeding. There was a small healing cut on the knuckle of her right index finger. Her jacket, I now saw, had a repaired tear along the left shoulder seam, the stitching a slightly different color from the original fabric. 3 years. I kept turning that number over in my mind like a stone, looking at what was underneath it. "How long have you been in Brooklyn?" I asked. "Since yesterday." Her voice was steadier now, but only just. "We took a bus. We were supposed to transfer at Port Authority, but Ethan fell asleep and I missed the stop." She pressed her lips together. "We ended up here. We walked until he said he was hungry, and this was the first place we found." The randomness of it hit me harder than I expected. If Sophie had not been looking over my shoulder, if we had sat at a different table, if Claire had chosen any other block to walk down. "Claire," I said, keeping my voice low and level, "I need to ask you something directly, and I need you to answer me the same way." Her eyes met mine. They were red-rimmed but steady, and there was a wariness in them that I recognized from the faces of people who have been lied about long enough that they no longer expect to be believed. "Did you take those files?" I asked. "The Phoenix Bridge designs. Did you take them and give them to someone at a competitor?" Claire's jaw tightened so hard I could see the muscle jump beneath her cheek. Then she said very quietly, very precisely, "No." "Did you take any money?" "No." "Did you have any kind of arrangement with anyone outside the company?" "No." Her voice cracked on the word, and she pressed one fist against her mouth for a moment, breathing through her nose. When she lowered her hand, her eyes were bright and wet, but her voice had steadied again. "I never took anything, Mr. Calloway. I never took a single file, a single dollar, a single phone call that Marcus didn't know about. Everything he told you was a lie, every single word of it." The coffee in front of me had gone cold. I wrapped both hands around the mug anyway, needing something to hold. "Then why did you run?" I asked. "If you were innocent, why didn't you stay and fight it?" Claire's laugh came out short and sharp, almost a sound of pain. "Because Marcus came to me the night before everything happened." She leaned forward slightly, dropping her voice further. "He stood in our kitchen, in our house, and he told me that if I said one word to you, if I tried to contact you or anyone else, Ethan would be the one who suffered for it." Her voice dropped to almost nothing. "He said accidents happen to children. He said he couldn't be responsible for what might occur if I made things difficult. My hands tightened around the mug so hard that I felt the ceramic press painfully into my palms. He threatened his own son, I said. The words tasted wrong in my mouth, like something I could not swallow properly. He didn't have to be specific. Claire's voice was fraying at the edges now, trembling despite everything she was doing to hold it still. That was the point. He knew I would understand what he meant, and he was right. 2 tears broke free and ran down her face before she could stop them. She reached up and pressed the back of her hand against her cheek, jaw clenched, furious at herself for crying. I am not a coward, Mr. Calloway. I want you to understand that. I did not run because I was weak. I ran because I could not protect Ethan and fight Marcus at the same time, and my son came first. He will always come first. From the end of the counter, I heard Sophie laugh at something bright and unguarded. Then, a beat later, I heard a sound I had not heard yet from that direction. A quieter laugh, shorter, more tentative, like a door opening, just a crack. Ethan. I looked down at the table. My jaw was aching from how hard I had been holding it together. You sent me something, I said. Before you left, didn't you? Claire's breath caught. She looked at me sharply. You found it. I found what happened to it, I said. The postal worker delivered something that morning, a thick envelope, the kind a person sends when they have something important to say. 41 minutes later, Marcus came and took it. I met her eyes. I know it never reached me, Claire. I know someone took it from the box before I ever saw it. The color that had slowly been returning to her face drained away again. Her hand came up and pressed flat against her sternum, as if she was trying to hold something in place inside her chest. How? She whispered. How do you know that? I set the cold mug down on the table. Outside, a delivery truck rumbled past the window, and the morning light shifted briefly before settling again. I have a camera, I said. An old one, the kind that records to a hard drive. I never learned how to clear the storage. I paused. I watched the footage last night. Claire stared at me. Her lips parted slightly. Her hand was still pressed against her chest, and I could see that it was shaking. Then you know, she said. The words came out barely above a breath. You know who took it? Yes, I said. Claire pressed both palms flat against the table. I could see her steadying herself the way a person does, before saying something out loud that they have only ever said inside their own head, turning it over one last time, checking the weight of it, making sure they can carry it through to the end. I need to go back further, she said. Before the night everything fell apart, because none of it makes sense unless you understand what I found first. Then go back, I said. I'm not going anywhere. She took one careful breath and began. 4 years ago, she told me she had been running point on 3 concurrent projects at Callaway Structural Engineering, including the early design phases of the Phoenix Bridge contract. She was good at her job. I knew that, had always known that. And part of being good at her job meant she paid attention to numbers. Not just the engineering calculations, but the financial architecture underneath a project. Budget allocations, vendor payments, cost projections versus actual expenditures. I started noticing discrepancies, she said. Small ones at first. A vendor invoice for materials that seemed high for the quantity ordered. A subcontractor payment that didn't match the work logged. I thought it was an accounting error. I flagged it internally and assumed someone would correct it. No one did, I said. No one did. Her voice tightened. So I kept looking, and the more I looked, the more I found. 3 vendors in particular were billing at rates significantly above market. One company had received 2 installment payments totaling nearly $40,000 for engineering consulting services, but when I tried to find any record of their actual work product, there was nothing. No reports, no site visits, no correspondence, just the payments going out. She paused. Becca appeared briefly to refill my coffee, and Claire waited until she had moved away before continuing. I traced the payment authorizations as far back as I could, Claire said. Every single one of them had been approved by someone operating under Marcus's direct chain of command. Not Marcus himself, he was careful about that, but people who reported directly to him. People who would not have approved significant expenditures without his knowledge. My jaw tightened. I said nothing because I did not trust what would come out if I opened my mouth. When Marcus realized I had been looking into it, Claire continued. He came home one evening, and he was calm. That was the part that frightened me most. He wasn't angry. He sat down across from me at the kitchen table, and he said I had been working too hard. He said the stress was getting to me. He said that good engineers sometimes start seeing patterns that aren't there when they've been staring at numbers for too long. Her mouth pressed into a thin line. He was so kind about it, so gentle. I almost believed him. But you didn't, I said. I didn't. She shook her head. Because 2 days later, my office keycard stopped working after hours. And a week after that, I found a text message in my sent folder that I had never written sent to a number I didn't recognize at 2 in the morning while I was asleep. Her voice dropped. He had access to my phone, Mr. Calloway. He had access to my email. He knew my passwords because I had trusted him with them, the way you trust your husband with things like that. And he used every single one of them. I set my coffee mug down with more force than I intended. The sound made Claire flinch slightly, and I immediately regretted it. I'm sorry, I said. Keep going. She nodded and straightened in her seat, pulling herself upright with a visible effort. The night of March 14th. She said, Ethan spiked a fever after dinner, 104 degrees. I called the pediatrician and she told me to take him to the emergency room immediately. Claire's voice shifted slightly, going quieter and more precise, as if she was reading from a document she had memorized. We arrived at Lenox Hill Hospital at 7:56 in the evening. I was with him for the entire intake process, through the examination, through the IV placement, through everything. I did not leave that hospital until after midnight. She looked at me steadily. The Phoenix Bridge design files were downloaded from my account at 8:43 that evening, while I was sitting next to my son's hospital bed, watching a nurse try to find a vein in his arm because he was dehydrated and crying and asking me why it hurt. The words landed in my chest like something physical. I thought about the timeline. Lenox Hill Hospital sits on the Upper East Side of Manhattan. Our company offices are in Midtown, roughly 2 miles away. Even if she had somehow left the hospital, traveled to the office, accessed the system, and returned, it would have required Ethan to be left alone in an emergency room at 7 years old, feverish and frightened for at minimum 45 minutes. The idea was not just logistically improbable. It was impossible for the woman sitting in front of me. Your account was accessed, I said, slowly working it through out loud, but not by you. And someone used my login credentials from a computer inside the executive suite, Claire said. Not my laptop, not my phone, a stationary terminal in a part of the building I rarely visited. She leaned forward slightly and her voice took on an edge that was not anger exactly, but something sharper and colder. Marcus had requested emergency override access to my account 3 months earlier. He told the IT administrator that I frequently forgot my password and that it created delays on urgent projects. The IT administrator created a backdoor reset function tied to an internal terminal. She paused. That terminal was in the executive suite, where Marcus worked, and I pressed 2 fingers against my temple and held them there. Under the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, the federal law that governs unauthorized access to computer systems in the United States, what Claire was describing would constitute a serious federal offense. Using another person's credentials to access a protected computer system, even within the same company, even with a cooperating IT administrator, crosses a clear legal line. The fact that Marcus had engineered the access months in advance suggested premeditation that went well beyond opportunism. Why didn't you go to the police? I asked. With what you had, the discrepancies, the timeline, the hospital records. Claire's laugh came out like a wound, short and involuntary and full of pain. With what exactly? The hospital records showing I was there. Marcus had already told your mutual friends that I had been showing signs of instability. Paranoia, he called it. Overwork. He had planted that story weeks before the night of the 14th, Mr. Calloway. Her voice cracked on the next words, and she pressed her fingers hard against her lips for a moment before she could continue. By the time I understood what he had done, the narrative already existed. I was the unstable wife who had stolen from her father-in-law's company. The receipts, the timeline, the logic, none of it would have mattered once people had already decided what kind of person I was. From the end of the counter, I heard Sophie say something that made Ethan laugh, a real laugh this time. Unguarded and sudden, as if it had escaped before he could catch it. The sound hit me somewhere I was not prepared for, and my eyes burned in a way I had not expected. That boy had not laughed freely in a very long time. I could hear it in the quality of the sound itself, surprised by itself, almost confused by its own existence. I pressed my hand flat against the table, and looked at Claire directly. "You said you prepared an envelope," I said. "Evidence, and you sent it to my house." "I worked on it for 2 weeks," Claire said, and now her voice was raw and shaking the careful composure she had been building, crumbling at the edges. "Everything I had, printed copies of the payment discrepancies, dates, vendor names, account numbers, a written account of every conversation with Marcus, the name of the IT administrator, the name of the conference where I met Daniel Mercer, a structural engineer I spoke with for maybe 10 minutes in Chicago, who Marcus later used as the supposed recipient of the stolen files." She pressed the back of her hand hard against her eyes, fighting the tears that were spilling over, despite everything. "I drove to your neighborhood myself, Mr. Calloway. I parked 2 blocks away and I walked to your house and I put that envelope in your mailbox with my own hands, because I thought I genuinely believed that if you read what was in it, you would ask questions. You would look into it. I trusted that much." Her voice broke completely on the last sentence. She pressed both hands over her mouth, her shoulders shaking, and for a long moment, the only sounds at our table were the ambient noise of the diner and the unsteady rhythm of her trying not to fall apart in a public place. I did not tell her it was all right. It was not all right. None of it was all right, and she deserved better than a hollow comfort from the man who had believed the lie about her for 3 years, without once picking up the phone to ask her side of the story. "I know," I said instead. Just that. "I know you did." Claire lowered her hands. Her face was wet and her eyes were swollen, but she met my gaze with a steadiness that cost her visibly and held it. "What happens now?" she asked. I thought about the footage I had watched the night before, the timestamp, the familiar silhouette, the way my son had walked up my front path with a key I had given him in trust, and walked away with something that was never meant for him. "Now," I said quietly, "I make a phone." We stayed at the diner another 20 minutes, long enough for Ethan to finish his pancakes and ask Sophie in a voice that had grown slightly less careful whether she had ever been to the Natural History Museum. Long enough for Claire to drink half a cup of coffee and let some color return to her face. Long enough for me to write Thomas Briggs's address on the back of a receipt and slide it across the table. "Thomas is an old friend," I told Claire. "He retired to Westchester 4 years ago. He has a guest room, and he does not know Marcus socially. You will be safe there." Claire looked at the address for a long moment. Her fingers closed around the slip of paper, slowly the way you hold something you are afraid might be taken back. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. I thought about that honestly before I answered. "Because I watched a video last night that I cannot unwatch," I said. "And because you put an envelope in my mailbox 3 years ago and trusted me to read it and I never got the chance." I held her gaze. "I owe you that chance now." She nodded once. Her jaw was tight and her eyes were bright, but she held herself together. "I paid—" The check said goodbye to Sophie and Ethan at the counter. Ethan looked at me when I shook his hand with those old careful eyes and said, "Thank you for breakfast, sir," in a voice so formal and so small that it took everything I had not to pull the boy into a hug, right there, and then I walked out into the March cold and got into my car. The drive back to Park Slope took 11 minutes. I remember because I watched the clock on the dashboard the entire way, needing something to focus on that was not the thing sitting at the center of my chest like a stone. My house on Garfield Place was quiet when I unlocked the front door. It had been quiet for 8 years since Eleanor died, and I had made my peace with that. But walking in that afternoon, the quiet felt different, heavier. I went directly to the small utility room off the kitchen, where I kept the home security recorder, an older model, the kind that wrote footage to a physical hard drive rather than uploading to a cloud server. My son-in-law had installed it for me 6 years ago and shown me how to view the footage, but I had never learned to delete anything. The drive held nearly 4 years of recordings, sorted by date. I found the date Claire had described, pulled up the exterior feed covering the front path and the mailbox. The timestamp read early afternoon. A postal worker appeared, opened the mailbox, placed a thick envelope inside, and moved on. Ordinary, unremarkable. I let the footage run. 41 minutes later, a car I recognized pulled up to the curb. Marcus got out. He was dressed casually. Weekend clothes, nothing that would draw attention. He walked up the front path with the relaxed, easy stride of someone who belonged there, which of course he did. He had a key. I had given it to him myself years ago because he was my son and I trusted him completely. He used that key now. The front door opened and closed. The timestamp ticked forward 1 minute, 2 minutes, 4 minutes, 7 minutes. At 9 minutes and 30 seconds, the door opened again. Marcus came back down the front path. His left hand was in his jacket pocket. His right hand was swinging loose at his side. The mailbox flag was down. The mailbox was empty. I watched that 9 minutes and 30 seconds 4 times. Each time I reached the moment he came back down the path with his hand in his pocket, something in the center of my chest tightened another degree, like a bolt being turned past the point where it should stop. My son. My only son. Walking up the path I had shoveled every winter for 30 years, using the key I had handed to him with my own hands, taking something that was never meant for him. I closed the laptop and sat in the dark of the utility room for a while, not because I needed to think, but because my legs had decided they were not ready to carry me anywhere yet. When I finally stood up, I went to the kitchen, filled a glass of water, and drank it, standing at the sink, looking out at the backyard. The oak tree Eleanor had planted the year Marcus was born was just beginning to bud, small and pale green against the gray March sky. I picked up my phone, scrolled to a number I had not called in almost 2 years. Raymond Cole had been my personal attorney for over 15 years. He was 61, careful and constitutionally incapable of panic, which was precisely what I needed. He answered on the second ring. "Henry, it's been a while." "It has," I said. "Raymond, I need to meet with you. Tomorrow morning, first thing. I have a situation that requires someone who knows how to handle evidence correctly before anything else happens." A brief pause. "How serious?" I looked out at the oak tree. "Serious enough that I need you to tell me the right way to do this. Not the fast way, the right way." Another pause, shorter this time. 8 o'clock, Cole said. "My office. Bring everything you have." "I will," I said. I hung up. The kitchen was very still. Outside, a neighbor's dog barked twice and went quiet. I thought about Marcus calling me that evening, as he often did on Saturdays, asking how I was feeling, asking whether I had eaten, asking in that warm and careful voice whether I had given any more thought to the succession plan for the company. When the phone rang 40 minutes later and his name appeared on the screen, I let it ring 3 times before I answered. "Dad." His voice was easy, unhurried. "How was your morning?" "Good," I said. "Sophie and I had breakfast." "Nice." A pause. "You sound tired." "I'm fine," I said. "Just a long day." "You should rest more," Marcus said. "You push yourself too hard." Another pause, and then smoothly, the way he always did it, "Have you thought any more about the transition timeline for the company?" I looked at the blank screen of my closed laptop on the counter. "I've been thinking about it," I said. "We'll talk soon." After I hung up, I stood in the kitchen for a long time, with both hands flat on the counter, looking at nothing. My son had just called to check on me, and every word out of his mouth had felt like a hand reaching into my chest and slowly closing around something vital. Tomorrow morning, I would sit down with Raymond Cole. We would do this correctly chain of custody-licensed investigators, every step documented and preserved. Not because I wanted to destroy Marcus, but because Claire had trusted me with the truth 3 years too late, and I was not going to waste it. Raymond Cole's office occupied the 14th floor of a building on Rector Street in Lower Manhattan, 4 blocks from the courthouse, where he had spent the better part of 3 decades untangling the kinds of problems that could not be solved with goodwill alone. His waiting room smelled like old paper and strong coffee, and his assistant, a composed woman named Gloria, who had worked for him longer than I had known him, waved me straight through without asking me to sign anything. Cole was already at his desk when I walked in. He was a lean man with close-cropped silver hair and the unhurried manner of someone who had heard too many urgent things to be rattled by urgency alone. He gestured to the chair across from him and poured me coffee without asking. "Talk," he said. I talked. I laid out everything in the order it had happened: the diner, Claire, Ethan, the camera footage, the timestamps, the hospital, the back door access to Claire's account. I put my laptop on his desk and showed him the video clip. Cole watched it without speaking, his expression giving away nothing, his fingers flat on the desk in front of him. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he asked, "What do you want the outcome to be?" "I want to know the truth," I said. "All of it. And then I want whatever happens next to hold up." Cole nodded slowly. "Then we do this in a specific order," he said, leaning forward. "First, you do not touch anything else yourself. No more reviewing footage, no more pulling files, no more conversations with people who work inside the company. The moment you start gathering evidence on your own, without documentation and proper handling, You create problems for yourself in any subsequent legal proceeding. Chain of custody, I said. Exactly. He tapped the desk once. In New York, state evidence gathered by an unlicensed individual without proper documentation can be challenged, excluded, or used to undermine your credibility. We hire a licensed private investigations firm. There are several I use regularly, all operating under New York General Business Law Article 7, which requires investigators to hold active state licensure. They document everything correctly from this point forward. He paused. The camera footage you already have. I want the original hard drive. Do not copy it, do not email it, do not show it to anyone else. Bring it to me, and I will have it authenticated by a digital forensics specialist. That becomes our foundation. I pulled the hard drive from my coat pocket and set it on his desk. Cole looked at it for a moment, then picked up his phone and spoke briefly to Gloria. Within 10 minutes, a courier had been called. Second, Cole continued, you do not confront Marcus, not yet, possibly not for some time. If he suspects you are investigating, he will begin moving things, deleting records, adjusting documents, calling in favors. Every action he takes to cover his tracks becomes additional evidence, but only if we are positioned to capture it. Understood, I said. Third, he met my eyes directly. I need you to be honest with me about one thing. Is there any part of you that does not want to find out what is at the end of this? The question sat between us. I thought about the oak tree in my backyard. I thought about Marcus's voice on the phone the night before, warm and easy, and asking about succession timelines. No, I said. There is no part of me that wants to stop. Cole gave one short nod. Then we begin. I left his office at 9:30 and walked 6 blocks to a coffee shop on Greenwich Street, where Janet Reeves was already waiting at a corner table with her hands around a ceramic mug, and the expression of a woman who had been turning something difficult over in her mind since I had called her the previous evening. Janet had been Callaway Engineering's chief financial officer for 22 years. She had started as a junior accountant the year I signed my first major contract, and she had grown with the company in the way that certain people do not, by climbing over others, but by simply being indispensable. She was 58 precise and constitutionally allergic to anything that resembled cutting corners. I trusted her the way you trust someone who has never once given you a reason not to. She looked up when I sat down, and the first thing she said was, "How bad is it?" "I don't know yet," I said. "That's why I need your help." I told her what I needed: a careful review of the Phoenix Bridge project, financials, specifically the access logs and the payment records from the 3 years prior to Claire's departure. I did not tell her about Claire. I did not tell her about the video. I only said that I had reason to believe the incident 3 years ago had not been accurately represented to me, and that I needed someone I trusted to look at the underlying records. Janet wrapped both hands tighter around her mug. Her knuckles whitened slightly. "Henry," she said carefully, "if I start pulling those records, people will notice." "Then pull them quietly," I said. "Frame it as a routine audit review. You have the authority to do that independently of Marcus." She looked at me for a long moment. Her jaw worked slightly the way it did when she was running calculations that had nothing to do with numbers. "How long have you been sitting on this?" she asked. "Since Saturday morning," I said. Something moved across her face, not quite pain, but close enough to it. She set her mug down carefully. "You know what I am going to find, don't you?" she said. It was not a question. "I think so," I said. "But I need to know for certain. And I need the documentation to say what the documentation says, not what I believe." Janet pressed her lips together. Then she straightened in her seat, pulled her shoulders back, and looked at me with the clear, direct expression she wore when she had made a decision she intended to keep. "Give me 2 days," she said. I nodded. "Take 3 if you need them." She reached across the table and picked up her mug again, and before she raised it to drink, she said something that I had been turning over ever since. "Henry," her voice was quiet, almost careful. "How long has it been since you let yourself ask whether you might have been wrong about something?" The question went in like a splinter, small entry point, significant depth. I did not have a good answer. I told her so. She nodded as if that was exactly what she had expected me to say, and drank her coffee. Outside, the Monday morning traffic on Greenwich Street moved in its slow, indifferent stream, and the March sky above Lower Manhattan was the flat white of a page not yet written on. 2 days, I thought. 2 days, and I would know whether the foundation I had built my trust on for 3 years was solid, or whether it had been hollow the entire time, and I had simply never thought to look underneath it. Patrick Sloan lived in a narrow row house in Woodside, Queens, 3 blocks from the elevated subway line. I found the address through Cole's investigative firm and drove out on Tuesday morning without calling ahead, because I did not want to give him time to decide he did not want to talk to me. He answered the door in a flannel shirt and reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, and when he saw who was standing on his front step, the color shifted in his face. Not quite guilt, not quite relief, but something complicated that lived in the space between the two. "Mr. Calloway," he said. "Patrick." I kept my voice even. "I think you know why I'm here." He stepped back from the door without a word and let me in. We sat at his kitchen table with coffee. Neither of us touched. Patrick was 52 heavier than I remembered from his years at the company, with the particular tired look of a man who had been carrying something he could not put down. He pulled his glasses off his forehead and turned them over in his hands repeatedly while he talked, as if the motion was the only thing keeping him anchored. "He told me it was a standard request," Patrick said. "Emergency override access for Claire's account. He said she forgot her passwords constantly, and it caused delays on urgent projects." He set the glasses down and pressed his palms flat on the table. I had no reason to doubt it. He was the COO. It was the kind of administrative request I processed a dozen times a year. "When did he ask you to delete the access logs?" I asked. Patrick's jaw tightened. 3 days after the Phoenix Bridge incident, he called me directly. Not email, not a ticket in the system, a phone call. He said the logs from that week were creating confusion during the internal review and asked me to clear them. His voice dropped. I told him I couldn't do that. That access logs were compliance records under our data retention policy. He said he understood completely. Patrick looked up at me. 3 weeks later, I was called into HR. Position eliminated. Effective immediately. My chest tightened. "Did you keep anything?" Patrick stood up without answering and disappeared into the back hallway. When he returned, he was carrying an old external hard drive, black the size of a paperback book. He set it on the table between us. "I kept a copy of everything from that period," he said, "because I knew that if something went wrong, I would be the person they pointed at. The logs show the exact terminal that accessed Claire's account the night of March 14th. He tapped the hard drive once. It was a stationary workstation in the executive suite. Not Claire's laptop, not her phone, not any device registered to her. His voice came out rougher than he seemed to intend. "She was not in that building, Mr. Calloway. Someone used her credentials from inside a room she had no reason to be in." I picked up my phone and called Cole's office. His assistant connected me immediately. "I need a courier at an address in Woodside, Queens," I said, within the hour. When I hung up, Patrick was watching me with an expression that had finally resolved itself into something I recognized. Not guilt, not relief, exhaustion. "I should have come forward sooner," he said. "I know that. You kept the records," I said. "That's what matters now." I stood and buttoned my coat. At the door, I stopped and turned back. Patrick was still sitting at the table, both hands flat on the surface, looking at the space where the hard drive had been. He looked like a man who had been holding his breath for 3 years and had finally cautiously exhaled and was not yet certain the air was safe. "Patrick," I said, "Cole's office will be in contact when they call pick up." He nodded without looking up. "I will." I walked back to my car through the cold Woodside morning, the elevated subway rumbling overhead as a train passed, shaking the air the way it does in neighborhoods where the infrastructure is old and the ground has learned to absorb that particular rhythm. I sat behind the wheel for a moment before starting the engine. The hard drive was already in the courier's hands. The logs existed. The terminal had a serial number and a physical location and a timestamp that put Claire 2 miles away from it. The structure was beginning to hold. Janet called as I was driving back over the Queensboro Bridge, the East River, gray and wide beneath me. She did not waste time with preamble. "The $118,000 Marcus showed you as proof that Claire received payment," she said. "It never touched her account, not a single dollar." Her voice was controlled, but I could hear the edge underneath it, sharp as a wire pulled too tight. "The money moved through a limited liability company registered in Delaware, Northridge Consulting, established 4 months before the Phoenix Bridge incident." "Who registered it?" I asked. "The name on the filing is a man named Gerald Whitmore." A pause. "He is the cousin of David Kane, who has been Marcus's operations manager for 6 years. I pulled over on 2nd Avenue because my hands were not entirely steady on the wheel. "Janet," I said, 4 months before. "Yes," she said quietly. 4 months before anything happened to those files, someone had already built the structure to move the money. Henry. Her voice caught slightly. This was not opportunistic. This was planned. I sat in the parked car on 2nd Avenue with the engine running and the heat on, watching pedestrians move past on the sidewalk, each of them going somewhere, with the uncomplicated certainty of people who did not know that the ground could shift without warning. 4 months of planning. A company built specifically to receive stolen money. An IT backdoor engineered months in advance. My son had not made a mistake. He had written a blueprint. I sat there long enough that the heat in the car became uncomfortable, and I had to turn it down. Long enough that the pedestrian light at the corner ahead of me cycled through its sequence 3 times without me registering it. Long enough for the thing I had been hoping somewhere beneath all of it was not true to become something I could no longer sustain. I thought about Marcus at 8 years old, standing beside me at the foundation pour for our first major bridge project. Hard hat, 3 sizes too big, grinning so wide his eyes were nearly closed. I had held his hand that morning and told him this was how you built something that lasted. I had meant it as a lesson about work, about integrity, about the invisible responsibility that comes with designing structures other people trust their lives to. He had listened to every word. He had simply applied it to something else entirely. I pulled back into traffic when the feeling in my hands had returned enough to trust them on the wheel. Cole needed to know about Northridge Consulting before end of day. Janet needed to keep pulling records quietly, systematically, in the manner of someone conducting a routine audit review rather than building a legal case. Every step documented, every finding preserved in a chain that could not be broken later by a defense attorney who knew how to look for gaps. 4 months of planning required more than one answer. It required more than one question. I picked up my phone at the next red light and called Cole. "Northridge Consulting LLC, I said when he answered. "Registered in Delaware. Gerald Whitmore, he's connected to David Kane, Marcus's operations manager." I paused. Janet confirmed the money never touched Claire's account. All of it moved through this company. Cole was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. The particular quiet of a man absorbing information and immediately beginning to organize it. "When was it incorporated?" he asked. 4 months before the Phoenix Bridge incident, I said. Another pause, shorter this time. "Then we need to pull every transaction that company touched," Cole said. "Not just the ones connected to Phoenix Bridge. All of them." His voice was measured, precise, the voice he used when something had confirmed what he already suspected. "Henry, this is bigger than one project." I looked out the windshield at the Manhattan street opening up ahead of me, at the flat gray March sky above the buildings, at the ordinary Tuesday morning, moving forward without any awareness of what was being assembled inside it. "I know," I said. I hung up and drove the rest of the way in silence, with the heat on low and the city moving past the windows and the weight of 4 months sitting exactly where it had settled at the center of my chest, where it intended to stay, until I had... Thomas Briggs lived 40 minutes north of the city in a town called Pleasantville, in a white clapboard house set back from the road behind 2 large maples that had not yet leafed out for spring. I had known Thomas since our 30s, when we had both been young engineers with more ambition than sense, and he was one of the few people in my life whose judgment I trusted, precisely because he had no stake in anything I was involved with. He met me at the door, handed me a cup of coffee, said, "She's in the kitchen," and went back to his crossword puzzle without asking a single question. That was Thomas. That had always been Thomas. Claire was sitting at the kitchen table, with both hands wrapped around a mug. She looked marginally better than she had at the diner she had slept, I thought, or at least attempted it. But the wariness in her eyes was still there, the particular watchfulness of someone who had learned that calm periods were not the same as safe ones. "You found something," she said. It was not a question. She could read it in my face before I sat down. "Several things," I said. I pulled out the chair across from her and settled into it, and then I told her everything. Patrick Sloan and the backdoor access request, the hard drive with the terminal logs, Northridge Consulting, and the 4 months of advanced preparation. Janet's confirmation that the money had never touched her account. I watched her face as I talked. She did not cry. She pressed her lips together at certain points, and once she turned her head toward the window and held it there for a moment, while her jaw worked and her throat moved. But she did not cry, and she did not interrupt me until I had finished. "He planned it 4 months out," she said finally. Her voice was very quiet, stripped of everything except the bare fact of it. I kept telling myself there was a possibility I had misread things, that maybe it was more chaotic than calculated. She looked down at her mug. 4 months. "Claire," I said carefully, "there is one more thing. The private investigations firm found a series of invoices." I slid a printed page across the table. Payments from a discretionary expense account at Callaway Engineering to a security services company in New Jersey. The billing descriptions say corporate monitoring. She looked at the page. She did not pick it up. "The addresses listed in their activity reports," I continued, "correspond to locations where you and Ethan have lived over the past 3 years. I paused. I counted 17. The word landed in the kitchen like something dropped from a height. Claire's hand came up and pressed flat against her sternum. Her fingers curled inward, slowly gripping the fabric of her shirt, and she drew one long breath that shook slightly on the way in and more on the way out. 17, she repeated. The word came out barely above a whisper. "Portland," I said. "Tucson, Memphis, Roanoke." I kept my voice steady because one of us needed to be. "And 13 others. Claire pressed her fist hard against her mouth. Her eyes filled, and this time she did not fight it. The tears ran down, and she let them sitting straight in her chair, with her fist against her lips, and her eyes bright and wet and furious. "Every time I thought we were safe," she said, her voice breaking through the words in pieces, "every time Ethan started to settle somewhere, made a friend at school, learned where the library was started, sleeping without the light on, something would happen. A man outside the school 3 days in a row. A phone call to our landlord asking if we still lived there." She pressed her eyes shut. I told myself I was being paranoid, that I was seeing patterns because I was frightened, but I was not paranoid. "No," I said. "You were not." She opened her eyes and looked at me, and the fury in them was so precise and so long contained that it was almost like looking at something structural, a force that had been under compression for 3 years, and had not broken only because she had not allowed it to. "He was not trying to catch us," she said. "Was he?" "No," I said. "I don't believe so. A custody case would have opened the company's financials to a court. He could not afford that kind of scrutiny, not with what was moving through those accounts. If he wanted to find you and take legal action, he had enough to do that years ago. What he wanted was for you to keep running, to stay frightened, to never feel stable enough to stop and fight back." Claire nodded once very slowly, as if she was confirming something she had suspected for a long time but had not been able to name. "I kept a record," she said. She reached into the canvas bag on the chair beside her and placed a notebook on the table. Dark green cover, soft from handling its pages, thick with 3 years of close handwriting. Every suspicious incident, every unfamiliar face, every phone call to a landlord or a neighbor, dates, times, locations, descriptions. She slid it toward me. I did not know what else to do with it, but I could not stop writing things down. I opened the notebook to the first page. The handwriting was small and precise and relentless. The first entry was dated 3 years and 2 months ago, from an address in Portland, Oregon. My throat tightened in a way that had nothing to do with the words on the page and everything to do with the image of a woman sitting alone in a series of rented rooms, writing things down in the dark, because it was the only form of control she had left. "There is something else," Claire said. She straightened in her chair and called toward the hallway. "Ethan." A pause. Then the soft sound of footsteps on hardwood, and Ethan appeared in the kitchen doorway in a gray sweatshirt, his dark hair pushed sideways from sleep. He looked at his mother, then at me with those careful measuring eyes. "The thing I asked you to keep," Claire said. "Can you bring it?" Ethan looked at her steadily for a moment. Then he turned and went back down the hallway without a word, and I heard the zip of a bag opening. Before I tell you what Ethan pulled out of that old toy car he had been carrying for 3 years across 17 cities, comment the number 8 right now to let me know you are still with me. Because what this 10-year-old boy had been holding without knowing it will change everything you think you understand about this story. A note before we continue: some details in this story include fictional elements built for depth and reflection. If that is not the kind of storytelling you are looking for, you are welcome to step away. Now no hard feelings at all. Ethan came back down the hallway carrying a toy car. It was small and old, the kind of die-cast model that used to sit on a shelf, rather than get played with a 1967 Ford Mustang in what had once been red, but had faded over the years to something closer to rust. One of the rear wheels was missing. There was a long scratch along the driver's side that I recognized because I had been there the afternoon it happened. Ethan had been 4 years old, and he had knocked it off a bookshelf in my study, and he had cried harder about the scratch than about the bump on his knee. I had told him it was all right. That scratches gave things character. He had kept it ever since. Ethan set the car on the kitchen table in front of his mother without a word. Claire picked it up and turned it over in her hands. Then she pressed her thumbnail into a small seam along the undercarriage, a joint I had never noticed, and worked a thin plastic panel loose from the base. Inside the hollow cavity, wedged tight against the frame, was a USB drive no larger than my thumbnail. Claire held it between her fingers and looked at me. Her hand was trembling just slightly, a fine tremor she could not entirely suppress. The night we left, she said, I had maybe 20 minutes to take what I could. Marcus had come home early and I did not know why. I had the drive ready. I had been copying files for several weeks whenever I had access. Project metadata, email records, payment authorizations. Everything I had found. Her voice was low and careful, each word placed deliberately. I knew he would check my bag before he let us out of the house. He had done it before going through my things under the pretense of helping me pack. So I put the drive in the car. She set the Mustang down on the table between us. I put it in the car because it was the one thing I knew he would never search, because it was the one thing he knew Ethan would never leave behind. I looked at my grandson. Ethan was watching me with those steady, serious eyes. He had carried this for 3 years without knowing what it was. He had packed it into his bag every time they moved Portland, Tucson, Memphis, Roanoke, and 13 other places, because it was the car his grandfather had given him, and it had a scratch that gave it character, and he had held on to it the way children hold on to the things that connect them to people they have lost. My throat closed completely. I reached out and put my hand briefly over Ethan's, and he let me, and neither of us said anything because there was nothing adequate to say. Why didn't you use it sooner? I asked Claire. Because using it meant Marcus would know I was fighting back. Her jaw tightened. And the moment he knew that the threat to Ethan stopped being theoretical. I needed someone standing beside me before I played that card. Someone with the resources and the standing to act on what was in it before Marcus could move to counter it. She met my eyes directly. I was waiting for someone like you. I just did not know if you would ever come. I called Cole from the kitchen table. He had a digital forensics specialist, a licensed examiner who worked regularly with law firms on corporate litigation, available the following morning. I drove the USB to his office in Lower Manhattan that evening, logged it into evidence with Gloria as witness, and had it in the specialist's hands by 9 the next morning. The report came back 48 hours later. I read it at Cole's desk while he sat across from me, watching my face. The files on the drive were extensive. Claire had been thorough in a way that spoke of someone who had understood, even as she was doing it, that she might only get one chance. The metadata embedded in the Phoenix Bridge design files showed version histories going back 14 months. Claire's user credentials attached to hundreds of individual edits, revisions, and notations, establishing beyond any reasonable challenge that she had been the primary architect of the project's core structural designs, long before anyone had accused her of stealing them. You cannot steal something you built, but it was the email records that made Cole set down his coffee and lean forward in his chair. There were 11 internal messages sent from Marcus's company account to addresses at 3 external organizations, spread across a period of 8 months. The messages used project code names, identifiers that meant nothing without the accompanying files, but the attachments told a different story. Proprietary load distribution calculations, foundation specifications, materials analysis that had taken Claire's team months to develop, sent out, piece by piece, months before the Phoenix Bridge incident ever occurred. He was selling it before he framed her for taking it, Cole said. He said it the way you say something you have suspected but hoped was wrong, in the voice of a man who had seen a great deal of human behavior and was still occasionally surprised by its range. Yes, I said. Then Claire was never the target. Cole sat back in his chair. She was the explanation, the story he needed in place for when someone eventually noticed the money. I pressed 2 fingers against my eyes and held them there. Outside Cole's window, Manhattan went about its business, the indifferent, relentless machinery of the city, moving through another afternoon without any awareness that, in a 14th floor office on Rector Street, a man was sitting with the evidence of his son's deliberate construction of a lie that had cost a woman 3 years of her life and a boy his grandfather. "There's one more thing," Cole said. He turned his monitor toward me. "Janet found it this morning." On the screen was a transaction summary. Payments from a Callaway Engineering holding account to a construction conglomerate headquartered in Los Angeles, routed through 2 intermediary companies. The amounts were not small. "How much total?" I asked. "Across 4 years, Cole said. "Our best current estimate is $2.3 million. The number sat in the room. "Phoenix Bridge was not the only project," I said. "No," Cole said. "It appears to have been the one where he needed a scapegoat because it was the one where the exposure was greatest. But the pattern goes back further." He paused. "Henry, this is not a man who made a series of bad decisions. This is a man who built a system." I looked at the transaction summary on the screen for a long time. I thought about the oak tree in my backyard. I thought about the scratch Mustang on Thomas Briggs's kitchen table. I thought about a boy who had packed a toy car into his... I drove home from Cole's office in the dark. The city moved around me the way it always did, indifferent, loud, alive with the business of people who had somewhere to be. And I moved through it like a man underwater, aware of the current, but not quite part of it. By the time I pulled into the garage on Garfield Place, it was past 8 in the evening, and I had not eaten since morning, but the idea of food was somewhere very far away. I went to my study and turned on the single lamp on the corner of my desk. Not the overhead light, just the one small lamp the way I used to work late when Eleanor was alive, and I did not want to wake her by coming to bed with the house blazing. The framed photograph on the desk was one I had kept there for 23 years. Marcus at 8 years old, standing beside me at the foundation pour for the first major bridge project I had ever won. He was wearing a hard hat, 3 sizes too large for his head, and he was grinning so wide his eyes were nearly closed. I remembered the exact weight of his hand in mine that morning. I remembered telling him that this was how you built something that lasted. I turned the photograph face down on the desk. Then I sat in the chair where I had sat for 40 years, and I let myself feel the full weight of what I now knew. $2.3 million, 4 years. A Delaware shell company built 4 months in advance. A backdoor engineered into his wife's account. A fabricated paper trail so thorough that it had convinced me a man who built his career on reading structural integrity without a single moment of genuine doubt. My son had not inherited my eye for hidden stress. He had inherited something else entirely. The patience, the precision. The understanding that the most effective lies are not dramatic, they are architectural, built slowly, load-bearing wall by load-bearing wall, until the structure can support any weight you need to place on it. I had taught him that, not the lying, but the building. I sat with that for a long time, long enough for the lamp to feel like the only warm thing in the house, long enough for the street outside to go quiet, long enough to stop feeling like a father who had been deceived and start feeling like a man who had a decision to make. The decision itself was not difficult. I had known it since the moment I watched the footage from the camera, since the moment I saw my son's hand close around an envelope that was never meant for him. The difficult part was not deciding. The difficult part was accepting what the decision meant. It meant no softening of it, no quiet conversation where Marcus could explain himself and I could find a way to believe him. No private resolution that protected the family name, while Claire remained a woman who had stolen from her father-in-law's company. It meant all of it, in the open, in front of people who could not be managed afterward. I picked up my phone, sent a short text to Cole tomorrow. We set the meeting. Cole's reply came in under a minute. "Understood. I'll prepare the agenda." Then I sat back and waited for what I knew was coming. Marcus called at 9:47. He called every few days, always in the evening, always with the same warm and unhurried quality that I had once found comforting, and now recognized as a performance so well practiced it had become indistinguishable from genuine feeling. "Dad," his voice came through the speaker easy and low. "How are you feeling? You sounded tired the last time we talked." "I'm all right," I said. "Long week." "You're pushing too hard." A pause loaded with what sounded like concern. "You know, I was thinking maybe it's time we sat down seriously and talked about the transition plan. Not in a formal way, just the two of us. I could come over Saturday morning." I looked at the face-down photograph on my desk. Actually, I said, keeping my voice slow and slightly worn at the edges, the voice of a man who was beginning to feel his age. I've been thinking the same thing. I'm not sure I want to carry all of this much longer, Marcus. A beat of silence. Very short, but I heard it. Really? Something shifted in his voice, subtle, controlled, but there. Like a man who has been waiting for a door to open and is being very careful not to lunge for it. I think that's wise, Dad. I really do. There's one thing I want, I said. Before anything is transferred, I want an independent review, a clean audit not for any particular reason, just so that when the transition happens, no one can come back later and say the books weren't in order. It protects you as much as it protects me. Another pause. Slightly longer this time. That makes sense, Marcus said. Absolutely. That's a smart move. He agreed too quickly. He always had when something suited him. I had spent 67 years reading structures for the points where they would give way under load, and I could hear it in his voice, the almost imperceptible acceleration of a man who had just seen an opening and was calculating the fastest path through it. I'll have my assistant set something up, I said. End of next week, maybe. Perfect. His voice had warmed by 2 full degrees. Get some rest, Dad. I mean it. After I hung up, I sat for a while longer in the pool of lamplight with the phone on the desk beside me and the photograph still face down where I had left it. In the next 10 days, Marcus would begin to move. He would start adjusting records, pulling documents, making the quiet administrative maneuvers of a man who believed he was consolidating before an inheritance. And every move he made would be captured by the investigative team Cole had already positioned, logged, and documented and preserved in a chain of custody that no defense attorney would be able to challenge. I had built things my whole life that were meant to hold weight. This would hold. Marcus arrived on Thursday evening with a bottle of Bordeaux and a smile that fit his face the way expensive clothes fit a man who has worn them long enough to forget they are not his skin. He set the wine on the kitchen counter without asking whether I wanted any. The way you do in a house you have already decided belongs to you. And then he looked around the room with the particular quality of attention that I now recognized for what it was. Not nostalgia, not affection, but inventory. You look tired, Dad, he said. He said it with genuine warmth. That had always been the most disorienting thing about Marcus. The warmth was real. Whatever he felt for me existed alongside everything else. He was not in contradiction to it. People are rarely one thing or the other. I understood that now, in a way I had not before. I am tired, I said. I lowered myself into the kitchen chair with the careful movements of a man whose joints had opinions about cold weather, and I let him see it. Sit down. Talk to me. He sat across the table and poured 2 glasses of wine without being asked. I've been thinking about the timeline, he said. For the transition. If we want to do this cleanly, we should start moving some of the operational authority now, gradually, so it doesn't look like an abrupt handover to the board. That makes sense, I said. I wrapped both hands around the wine glass, but did not drink. The review first, though. I want everything documented before anything transfers. You understand that? Of course. He nodded, easy and immediate. I think the review is smart. It protects both of us. He leaned back in his chair and crossed one leg over the other, comfortable in a way that made something move coldly through my chest. I was thinking Raymond Cole's firm could handle it. He knows the company. I looked at my son across the table, at the jaw that was shaped like mine, at the hands that were built like mine, at the eyes that had looked at me with love for 41 years and were looking at me with love right now, even as the mouth they belonged to was suggesting I use my own lawyer to authenticate a transition that Marcus had already decided the terms of. Maybe, I said. I'll think about it. He stayed for 90 minutes. We talked about the company, about a project in New Jersey that was running behind schedule, about whether the oak tree in the backyard needed to be pruned. He refilled my glass twice, though I had barely touched it. When he finally stood to leave, he put his hand on my shoulder in the doorway and squeezed once. Get some rest, he said. Let me carry some of this weight for a while. That's what I'm here for. After his taillights disappeared at the end of the street, I poured both glasses of wine down the kitchen sink, rinsed them, and called Cole. He's moving, I said. I can feel it. Good, Cole said. Because our team is already seeing activity. He accessed the company document management system at 11:47 this morning from his personal laptop. He spent 31 minutes in the Phoenix Bridge project folder. My hand tightened on the phone. What was he doing in there? Viewing mostly. Some metadata was touched on 3 files. Our forensics team flagged it automatically. Any access to those folders triggers a shadow log that Marcus doesn't know exists. Cole's voice was measured precise. He's looking at what's there, trying to understand what an independent auditor would find. And tomorrow. Tomorrow, he'll start moving things, Cole said. Or trying to. Every deletion attempt, every file, transfer, every adjusted record gets captured in a parallel system our investigators installed last week. The more he cleans, the more we have. The next 48 hours were the longest of the investigation. I went to the office on Friday morning and sat at my desk and did the ordinary work of running a structural engineering firm, reviewing specifications, signing off on invoices, taking a call from a project manager in Albany about a drainage issue on a highway overpass. I moved through the day with the careful surface-level composure of a man who had nothing on his mind except the work in front of him, because I knew Marcus had people in the office who reported back to him, and the performance had to be consistent. Cole called at 4 in the afternoon. His voice had the particular quality it got when something had confirmed what he had already suspected. 2 vendors submitted invoice adjustments this morning, he said. Both retroactive, both reducing bounce that appeared in the records we flagged. One of them is Northridge Consulting's primary contractor, the entity that received the money that was supposed to go to Claire. A pause. Henry, someone called those vendors and asked them to revise their documentation. Can you prove it was Marcus? The calls came from a prepaid phone purchased in cash at a drugstore in Midtown 3 weeks ago, Cole said, which is itself a data point. People who make routine business calls don't use prepaid phones. On Saturday morning, a junior financial analyst named Brett Holloway sent an email to his personal account from his company computer. The email contained a single attached spreadsheet, a summary of payment records from the discretionary expense account that Janet had been quietly reviewing. Brett was 26 years old and had worked at Callaway Engineering for 14 months. When Cole's team identified the transmission, they cross-referenced Brett's calendar and found that he had had a 40-minute lunch with Marcus the previous Wednesday. Cole called me with that one in the evening, and I sat at the kitchen table with my hands flat on the surface and stared at the grain of the wood for a long time after he finished. He's using a kid, I said. He's using whoever is available, Cole said, not unkindly, but without softening it either. Henry, this is actually useful to us. Brett Holloway didn't know what he was transmitting or why. When this comes to light, he becomes a witness, not a co-conspirator. Marcus handed us someone on the inside who has no reason to protect him. I thought about Brett Holloway, 26 years old, sitting across a lunch table from my son, nodding at whatever reasonable-sounding thing Marcus had said to him. I thought about how easy it must be when you are good at it, to look like the most trustworthy person in any room you walk into. Set the meeting, I said. Whatever date works. I'm ready. Cole was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice had a quality I had not heard from him before. Not quite gravity, but close to it. I'll send the agenda Monday morning, he said. Henry, what you're about to do, make sure you're prepared for what comes after the meeting, not during it. After. I looked at the face-down photograph. I had moved from my study to the kitchen counter without quite deciding to. I've been preparing for, after my whole life. Robert Haynes called on a Tuesday afternoon while I was reviewing load calculations for a project in White Plains. Robert and I had known each other since 1987, when we had both been working for the same mid-sized engineering firm in Queens and carpooling to job sites in a truck that overheated every time the temperature went above 80 degrees. He had retired 6 years ago and now split his time between a house in Connecticut and a standing weekly golf game he took more seriously than most people take their careers. He was not a man who called without a reason. Henry, he said when I picked up. Got a minute? For you always? I said. What's going on? A pause. Robert was not a man who paused, which told me immediately that whatever he was about to say had been sitting with him for a while, being turned over, being weighed. I had lunch with Marcus last week, he said, at that Italian place on 52nd he likes. He mentioned it, I said, which was not true, but gave Robert permission to continue without feeling like he was delivering news. He talked about you, Robert said. He was concerned. That was the word he kept using. Concerned. Another pause. He said you had been making some decisions at the company lately that seemed out of character, that you'd approve certain things, and then had no memory of approving them. That you were, maybe, he stopped, cleared his throat. He said you might be having some difficulty with your memory, Henry. He said it was probably just fatigue, but that he'd noticed it a few times and was starting to worry. I set down my pencil on the desk, very carefully, the way you set down something fragile when your hands are not entirely steady. He said that? I said. He did. Robert's voice was uncomfortable in the way that good men's voices get when they are relaying information they suspect they should not be relaying. I'm only telling you because I've known you for 38 years, and if something was genuinely wrong, I would want someone to tell me. But Henry, it didn't sit right with me. The way he said it. It was too... He searched for the word. Practiced, like he'd said it before. Something cold and clear moved through me from the top of my skull straight down, like he'd said it before. Robert had just handed me the most precise description of Marcus's method I had heard from anyone who was not already inside the investigation, because that was exactly what it was. Practiced. A thing said enough times in enough rooms that it had acquired the smooth, convincing surface of something true. Tired, unstable, not to be trusted. That was what Marcus had said about Claire 4 years ago, to anyone who would listen, and now delivered through a different mouth in a different room. Here it was, again repackaged, refined, aimed at me. Robert, I said, I appreciate you calling, genuinely, and I want you to know that my memory is fine, my mind is fine. I've been tired, yes, but I'm 67, not 107. I paused. How many other people has he said this to? A beat of silence. I don't know, Robert said. But the way he brought it up, it wasn't the first time he'd had that conversation, I could tell. After I hung up, I stood at my office window and looked out at the city for a long time. My jaw ached from how hard I had been holding it together, and I consciously made myself unclench it, rolling my shoulders back, breathing slowly through my nose the way Eleanor had taught me when I was younger, and less practiced at absorbing things that wanted to break me. Marcus had not thought of something new. He had reached back into the same toolkit, pulled out the same instrument, and aimed it at the next person standing between him and what he wanted. He had used it on Claire first. Now he was using it on me. I picked up my phone and called Cole. Robert Haynes just called me, I said when Cole answered. Marcus has been telling people I'm losing my memory. Cole was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. That's actually very helpful, he said. It establishes a behavioral pattern. Same method, different target. A good attorney can use that. A pause. It also means he's accelerating. He wouldn't be doing this unless he felt the timeline pressing. Set the meeting for next Monday, I said. Whatever it takes. Already drafting the agenda, Cole said. Quarterly governance review and succession planning. I'll send it to all parties by end of day tomorrow. Marcus will receive it at the same time as everyone else, nothing that signals he's the subject rather than the audience. And Claire, I'll arrange a visitor authorization through building management, Cole said. Her name goes on the list as an external consultant. She comes in through the main entrance, checks in at the desk, gets a badge. Completely routine. No one will question it. That evening I drove to Westchester. Claire was in the kitchen at Thomas's house when I arrived, sitting at the table with a cup of tea and a book she had clearly not been reading. It was open to the same page it had been on. The last time I was there, I was almost certain. She looked up when I came in, and something in my face made her set the book down entirely. What happened? She said. I told her about Robert's call, about the word practiced, about Marcus reaching back into the same toolkit he had used on her 4 years ago. Claire's teacup came down on the saucer, harder than she intended, rattling sharply, and she pressed both hands flat on the table, as if she needed the solidity of it beneath her palms. Her jaw tightened until the muscle jumped visibly under her cheek. He told people I was paranoid, she said. Her voice was shaking with a fury so compressed it had gone almost quiet. He told your friends, he told colleagues, he told anyone who asked where I had gone, and now he's telling them you're forgetting things. She looked up at me, and her eyes were bright and fierce and full of 3 years of being called something she was not. He doesn't even need to change the script, he just changes the name. No, I said, he doesn't. She pressed her fingers hard against her mouth for a moment, breathing through it, getting herself back under control. When she lowered her hand, the fury was still there, but it had settled into something steadier, something with weight and direction. Monday, I told her. The meeting is Monday. Cole will have everything in place. You come in through the main entrance, give your name at the desk, get a badge. You wait outside the conference room until I give the signal. I held her gaze. I need you to be there, Claire. Not because I need a witness, because you have been the only person in this situation who has told me the truth from the beginning, and you deserve to be in that room when the truth is finally the loudest thing in it. Claire's eyes filled. She did not look away. She let the tears come this time, without fighting them, sitting straight in her chair, with her hands on the table and her chin up, crying in the way that people cry when they have been waiting a very long time for something, and have finally been told it is almost here. "Okay," she said. Her voice was thick but steady. "Monday." Before I left, I paused in the hallway. Through the half-open door of the guest room, I could see Ethan at the small desk Thomas had set up for him, bent over a sheet of paper with a pencil, drawing something with the focused, unhurried concentration of a child who has found a thing he is good at. He was drawing what looked like a bridge. I stood there for a moment longer than I should have, looking at my grandson drawing a bridge in a borrowed room, in a house that was not his, in a life that had been made deliberately unstable by a man who shared his blood. Then I walked out to my car and drove back to Brooklyn in the dark, and I did not let myself feel anything else until I was safely home and the door was closed behind me. Douglas Price appeared at my office door on Thursday afternoon without an appointment. He was 49, heavy-set, with the look of a man who had not been sleeping well, dark circles pressed deep beneath his eyes, his collar slightly off-center, his hands gripping the door frame as though he needed the support. I had known Douglas for 11 years. In all that time, I had never seen him look like this, like something had been eating at him from the inside for long enough that it had started to show through the surface. "Mr. Calloway," he said, "do you have a few minutes?" I closed the folder on my desk. "Sit down, Douglas." He came in and sat in the chair across from me and immediately leaned forward with his elbows on his knees, his hands clasped together so tightly that his knuckles had gone pale. He stared at the floor for a moment. Then he looked up at me, and his eyes were red at the rims, and his jaw was working the way a man's jaw works when he has been rehearsing something for days and is still not sure he can get through it. "I need to tell you something," he said. "I should have told you a long time ago. I know that. I know it doesn't help to say that now, but I need you to know that I knew it was wrong, and I told myself it was minor, and I—" His voice cracked. He pressed his lips together hard, pulling himself back from the edge of it. "I'm sorry. I'll just say what I came to say." "Take your time," I said. Douglas drew one long breath. "About 3 years ago, Marcus came to me with a request. He said certain payment descriptions in our vendor records were creating confusion during internal reviews, that the categories were too broad and needed to be simplified. He asked me to revise the descriptions on about a dozen line items. He looked at me steadily, his jaw tight. I did it. I told myself it was an administrative adjustment, that I was cleaning up messy bookkeeping. But the line items he asked me to change were the ones that ran through Northridge Consulting. My chest tightened. I kept my face still. "He also asked me something else," Douglas continued. His voice dropped lower, rougher. "He asked me in a separate conversation whether it was theoretically possible to make it appear that a specific employee had accessed a system remotely without actually being present. I told him I wasn't in IT, I didn't have that kind of knowledge." He paused. He thanked me and moved on like it was a casual question. But I knew it wasn't casual, and 2 weeks later, everything with Claire happened. Douglas's hands tightened against each other until I could hear the pressure in his knuckles. I told myself I hadn't done anything, that I hadn't helped directly. But I knew what he was asking, and I let it go, and that woman lost 3 years of her life, and His voice broke completely. He pressed the back of his hand against his mouth, his shoulders shaking once hard, before he brought himself back under control. "I heard you were doing an independent review," he said, his voice still rough. "I couldn't let it go through without saying something. Whatever happens to me because of this, I understand. I just couldn't keep carrying it." I stood up, walked to the door, and told my assistant to call Raymond Cole's office and tell him I was bringing someone over immediately. Douglas looked up. "Am I in trouble?" "You came forward," I said. "That matters. Cole will advise you on what comes next." I held the door open. "Douglas? The question you said Marcus asked, about making it appear an employee had accessed a system remotely. Did he use Claire's name?" Douglas met my eyes. His were still wet, still raw. "He didn't have to," he said. I drove Douglas to Cole's office in Lower Manhattan. Cole took his statement with a court reporter present documenting everything, properly preserving the chain. Afterward, Douglas sat in the waiting room, looking like a man who had put down something very heavy, and was not yet sure his legs remembered how to work without the weight. That night, I sat in my kitchen with the face-down photograph still on the counter and called Claire. "Tomorrow is Friday," I said. "Monday is the meeting. I want you to know that every piece is in place." Douglas Price came to me today. He confirmed what Marcus asked him to do. A pause. "You were never alone in this, Claire. You just didn't know yet who was going to stand up." On the other end of the line, Claire's breath caught. Then very quietly she said, "Is it really over?" I looked at the photograph on the counter, at the familiar outline of it, face down a shape I had known my whole adult life. "Monday," I said. "It ends Monday." The conference room on the 23rd floor had floor-to-ceiling windows that looked north toward Midtown, and on a clear Monday morning in late March, the light came in, flat and cold and honest, the kind of light that does not flatter anything. I arrived 40 minutes early. I sat at the head of the table and did not open my laptop and did not review my notes because I did not need to. I had been carrying everything in this room in my chest for weeks. What I needed was the quiet and the light and the 40 minutes to remind myself why I was here and what I owed to the people who were not yet in the room. The advisors and accountants arrived between 8:30 and 8:55, filing in with the particular slightly puzzled energy of people who have received a formal agenda that tells them very little about why they have actually been summoned. They poured coffee, they took their seats, they made the small talk of professionals who are not yet sure what register the morning requires. Marcus arrived at 9 o'clock exactly. He was wearing a charcoal suit I had not seen before. New, expensive, the kind of thing a man buys when he wants to look like someone who belongs at the head of a table. He came through the door with his hand already extended, working the room the way he always did. A word for each person. A name remembered, a question asked, with what appeared to be genuine interest. He was very good at this. He had always been very good at this. When he reached me, he put his hand on my shoulder and squeezed once. "You're looking better, Dad," he said low enough that only I could hear it. "More rested." "Thank you," I said. "Sit down, Marcus." He sat 2 seats to my left, not at the opposite end, which would have felt confrontational, but closed the position of a son at his father's side. Deliberate. Everything Marcus did in a room was deliberate. He spoke for 22 minutes. I had expected him to be good. He was better than I expected. He laid out a vision for Callaway Engineering's next decade with the confidence and specificity of someone who had been preparing this presentation for months, which I understood now he had. New contracts in the Southeast, an expansion into infrastructure consulting, a reorganization of the project management structure that would, he said, bring the company in line with industry best practices. He was persuasive. Several of the advisors were nodding. Then he paused, adjusted his cufflink, and said, "Of course none of this would have been possible without navigating the difficulties of 3 years ago, the breach of trust, the loss of proprietary material, the situation with Claire." He shook his head with what appeared to be genuine regret. That was a painful chapter, but the company came through it, and I think it made us stronger. The room accepted this. People always accepted things said with sufficient confidence and sufficient sorrow. I let him finish. I waited until he had settled back in his chair with the particular satisfied posture of a man who believes the hard part is over. Then I said, "Are you certain that's what happened?" Marcus looked at me. Something moved behind his eyes, quick controlled, gone almost before it appeared. "Dad, we all know what happened." "We know what you told us happened," I said. "Those aren't the same thing." I looked around the table. "There's a distinction I'd like everyone in this room to understand before we go any further." I looked at Marcus directly. "Claire stole the Phoenix Bridge designs. She received payment. She left with a man named Daniel Mercer." I paused. "Is that the story you want to stand behind? In this room in front of these people right now, is that the story you're committing to?" Marcus's jaw tightened slightly. His hands on the table were very still. "Henry, I don't know what you think you're—" "Yes or no," I said, a beat. The room had gone very quiet. "Yes," Marcus said. His voice was steady. "That is what happened." I stood up. "No," I said, "it isn't." I walked to the conference room door and opened it. Claire stepped through. The sound Marcus made was not a word. It was something that lived below language, a short, compressed exhalation. The sound of a man whose internal architecture has just taken a load. It was not built to carry. His face did not go pale gradually. It went pale all at once like a light being switched off. He stared at her. Then he turned to me, then back to her. And this was the moment, the room understood everything. Before a single document had been placed on the table, he said, "What is she doing here? Not why is she here, not this can't be, but what is she doing here?" The question of a man who knows with absolute precision why a specific person should not be in a specific place. I looked at my son across the length of the conference table. "That," I said, "is an excellent question." I walked back to my seat at the head of the table. Marcus had not moved. He was watching me with an expression that had not yet decided what it wanted to be. Not quite fear, not quite calculation. Something suspended between the two, like a structure waiting to find out which way it was going to fall. Claire had taken a chair near the door, away from the main table, her hands folded in her lap, her back straight. She did not look at Marcus. She looked at me. I opened the folder in front of me and placed the first document on the table. "Lenox Hill Hospital," I said. "Emergency Department admission record, March 14th. Claire Donovan Calloway and her son, Ethan, admitted at 7:56 in the evening. She did not leave until after midnight." I slid it toward the center of the table where everyone could see it. The Phoenix Bridge design files were downloaded from her account at 8:43 that same evening, from a terminal inside this building. I paused. She was 2 miles away sitting next to her son's hospital bed. The room was very still. Marcus's jaw tightened. "There are ways to access a system remotely," he said. His voice was controlled. Reasonable, the voice he used when he was buying time. "That record doesn't prove she wasn't. The terminal logs do," I said. I placed the second document on the table. Patrick Sloan's hard drive analysis authenticated by Cole's forensics team, identifying the exact at the workstation serial number, physical location access timestamp. "The download originated from a stationary terminal in the executive suite," I said. "A terminal that Claire had no assigned access to and no documented reason to use." I looked at Marcus. "A terminal that you accessed regularly." Marcus's hands on the table pressed flat. His knuckles whitened at the edges. I placed the third document. "Northridge Consulting LLC Delaware registration formation, date the name of the registered agent and his relationship to David Kane, Marcus's operations manager." "The $118,000 you showed me as proof that Claire received payment?" I said. "It never touched her account. It moved through this company, which was incorporated 4 months before the Phoenix Bridge incident occurred." I let that number sit in the room. 4 months. Before anything happened to those files, the structure to move the money already existed. One of the accountants at the far end of the table had stopped taking notes. He was simply watching. I placed the fourth document. The still image from my home security system timestamp, visible Marcus's silhouette on my front path, the mailbox flag moving from up to down. "You came to my house," I said. "You used the key I gave you. You took an envelope from my mailbox that Claire had sent to me, an envelope containing documentation of everything she had found. You took it before I ever saw it." My voice stayed level. I had practiced staying level. "You made certain I would never have the chance to hear her side." Marcus's mouth opened. "Dad, that's not—" "The fifth item," I said. "The security company invoices, 17 locations. 3 years of corporate monitoring payments from a Callaway Engineering discretionary account, cross-referenced against the towns where Claire and Ethan had lived. You used company money," I said, "to track your wife and your son across 17 cities over 3 years, not to bring them home, not to pursue any legal remedy, to ensure they stayed frightened and kept moving and never felt safe enough to stop." The room had stopped breathing. Marcus turned to the advisors. His voice shifted warmer now, almost wounded. "I think what's happening here is that my father has been presented with a very selective reading of—" "The sixth item," I said. "The Los Angeles transaction summary, $2.3 million, 4 years. The intermediary companies, the construction conglomerate, the routing structure that had taken Janet and Cole's investigators 3 weeks to fully map." "Phoenix Bridge was not the only project," I said. "It was simply the one that required a scapegoat." Marcus's face had gone through several colors. It had settled now on something pale and rigid, a controlled blankness that I recognized as the last defense of a man who has not yet decided to give up, but has run out of things to say. I placed the final document. The forensics report on the USB drive, the metadata establishing Claire's authorship of the Phoenix Bridge designs. the email records showing Marcus directing proprietary information to outside parties months before any accusation was made against her. Claire reached into the bag beside her chair and placed the green notebook on the table. She did not say a word. She simply set it down. Marcus looked at the notebook. Something moved across his face fast. Involuntary gone immediately. But I saw it. Everyone in the room saw it. He looked around the table, at the accountants, the advisors, the people he had spent years cultivating. His eyes moved from face to face with the particular desperation of a man who has always been able to find an ally in any room and is discovering for the first time that there is not one here. His voice, when it finally came, was very quiet. "This is a misreading," he said. "All of this can be explained. You're taking isolated pieces and constructing a narrative that—" "Marcus." My voice came out low and tired and final. "There is no one left in this room who is going to help you explain it." He looked at me. His chest rose and fell once hard, and for the first time in 41 years I looked at my son and did not recognize the person looking back at me. Marcus sat very still for a long moment. The conference room had the particular quality of silence that follows something irreversible, not the silence before a storm, but the silence after one when the air has changed, and everything that was standing is either still standing or it isn't. Several of the advisors had pushed back slightly from the table, without seeming to realize they had done it, the unconscious physical retreat of people who want to be less present in a room than they currently are. Marcus looked at his hands on the table. Then he looked at me. "You're doing this," he said, "because of her." He did not look at Claire when he said it. His voice had lost the warmth entirely now. What was underneath was harder and colder, and in its own way more honest than anything he had said all morning. "She came back after 3 years with a story, and you believed it over your own son." "I believed evidence," I said. "There's a difference. She manipulated you." His jaw tightened. "She knew exactly what she was doing when she walked into whatever diner or wherever you found her, and she knew exactly what buttons to push to turn you against me. That's what she does. That's who she is." I looked at him steadily. "Marcus? A 10-year-old girl noticed that your wife and your son hadn't eaten. That's how this started. A child looked across a diner and asked why 2 people were sitting in front of empty glasses." I paused. "You built something very elaborate and very careful, and it came apart because a little girl asked a simple question." Something crossed his face at that. I could not name it precisely. It was not remorse. It was something colder, the particular anguish of a meticulous person confronting the randomness of what undid them. He turned to the advisors. His voice shifted back toward reasonable, toward controlled, one final attempt to find purchase on a surface that had nothing left to grip. "I want it on the record that I dispute everything presented in this room today. I will be retaining independent legal counsel, and I expect—" "That is absolutely your right," I said. "Raymond Cole's office will be in contact regarding the suspension of your system access effective today. The evidence compiled in this investigation, which includes documentation related to wire fraud, misappropriation of trade secrets under the Defend Trade Secrets Act, unauthorized computer access under the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, and the unlawful surveillance of private individuals under New York state law, has been preserved in accordance with proper chain of custody and will be made available to the relevant authorities." I kept my voice even. Factual, the voice of a man reading a load calculation. "I will not be making legal determinations on your behalf, but I will not be concealing anything on your behalf either." Marcus stood up. He straightened his jacket, adjusted the cuff of his sleeve, these small automatic gestures of a man putting himself back together by rearranging the exterior when the interior has stopped responding. Then he picked up the leather folder he had brought in, with his 22 minutes of vision for the future, and he walked to the door. He stopped with his hand on the frame and turned back. His eyes went to me, not to Claire, and what was in them was something I had no category for, not hatred, not grief, but something that lived in the compressed space between the two. "I did what I thought was necessary," he said, "for the company, for the future. The company belongs to the people who built it honestly," I said. "It always has." He left. The door closed behind him. The room exhaled a collective, almost physical release of pressure that had been accumulating since 9 o'clock. 2 of the advisors immediately reached for their phones. The accountant at the far end of the table closed his notebook, opened it again, closed it a second time. I looked at Cole, who was standing near the window. He gave me a single nod. Everything would proceed from here through the proper channels. He would handle the mechanics, the filings, the communications with the relevant authorities. I did not need to manage what came next. That was why I had called him 6 weeks ago. The room cleared gradually. I did not rush it. When the last advisor had gone, I looked across the table at Claire. She was sitting very straight in her chair, both hands flat on the table in front of her, staring at the middle distance with the expression of someone who has been bracing for an impact for so long that when it finally does not come, the body does not immediately know what to do with the absence of it. Her eyes were dry. Her jaw was set. But her hands, I noticed, were trembling very finely, very slightly, the tremor of something that has been held under tension for 3 years and has just been told it can let go. "Claire," I said. She looked at me. Her throat moved. "Are you all right?" I asked. Her mouth pressed together for a moment. Then she said very quietly, "I don't know yet. I think I might need a minute to find out." "Take as many as you need," I said. She pressed both hands over her eyes and bent forward in the chair, her shoulders rounding, and she cried hard and sudden and completely the way people cry, when they have been keeping something compressed for so long that when the release finally comes, it is not graceful, but it is real. Her whole body shook with it. She pressed her hands harder against her face and cried without restraint, in a conference room on the 23rd floor of a building in Midtown Manhattan, while the city moved on, outside the windows, indifferent and vast and entirely unaware.
I did not say anything. I simply stayed. After a while, she lifted her head. Her face was wet and her eyes were swollen, and she looked exhausted in a way that went deeper than sleep deprivation. She looked like someone who had just set down something very heavy for the first time in a very long time. "He took the letter from your mailbox," she said. Her voice was still unsteady. "3 years ago. He made sure you never had the chance to hear me." "Yes?" I said. "And you still—" She stopped, started again. "You still looked when you found out." "I owed you that," I said. "I should have looked 3 years ago. I am sorry that I didn't." Claire looked at me across the empty conference table in the cold, flat light of a March morning and said, "I know." Those 2 words cost her something. I could hear it, and I accepted them for what they were. Not forgiveness exactly, not yet, but something that might become it. A door left open. The weeks that followed did not look like anything dramatic. That was the part no one tells you about, the part after the confrontation, after the door closes and the room empties and the adrenaline that has been holding everything upright for weeks finally releases its grip. What comes next is not resolution. It is paperwork. It is phone calls. It is sitting across a desk from a court reporter, while a man you have known for 11 years recounts in careful and specific language the things he saw and did not report. It is the slow, unglamorous machinery of accountability which moves on its own schedule and does not care how ready you are for it to be finished. Cole managed the process with the methodical competence that had made him worth every dollar I had ever paid him. The evidence package authenticated documented chain of custody intact from the moment I had placed Patrick's hard drive in Cole's hands 6 weeks earlier was submitted to the appropriate federal and state authorities. Cole did not rush it, and he did not dramatize it. He simply moved it forward, step by careful step, the way you build something meant to last. Patrick Sloan came in on a Wednesday morning and gave his formal statement with a court reporter present and Cole seated across the table. When it was over, Patrick stood in the hallway outside Cole's office and shook my hand for a long time, without saying anything that needed to be said. His eyes were red at the edges. His grip was firm. "Thank you for coming," I told him. "I should have come sooner," he said. "You kept the records," I said. "That's what mattered." Douglas Price gave his statement 2 days later. He was quieter than Patrick, more contained, the specific quietness of a man who has made peace with what his silence cost, and is not looking for absolution, only for the chance to correct what he can still correct. When Cole's assistant showed him out, Douglas paused at the door and looked back at me. "How is she?" he asked. "Claire." "Getting there," I said. He nodded once and left. Janet Reeves continued working. She came to my office on a Thursday afternoon with a revised summary of the financial irregularities, cleaner, now more precisely mapped, the kind of document that would hold up under the scrutiny of people far more skeptical than I was. She set it on my desk and smoothed the corner of the top page with 2 fingers, a small gesture of care that told me she had been working on it for a long time.
The board will want to meet, she said.
I know, I said. Schedule it. She started to stand, then paused. Henry, for what it's worth, I'm glad you looked. I did not have a response adequate to that. I told her so, and she seemed to understand. I signed documents for 11 days. Forms I had not known existed for processes I had not anticipated needing. Each signature was a deliberate act, not punitive, but truthful. I was not signing to punish Marcus. I was signing to stop protecting him at the expense of the truth, which was something I had been doing without understanding. I was doing it for 3 years. One evening I came home to a kitchen that was quieter than usual, which should not have been possible since it was always quiet, but somehow was. I had not eaten since morning. I stood at the counter and made a sandwich and ate it standing up, looking out at the backyard where the oak tree had leafed out fully. Now the pale green of early April deepened into something denser and more committed. I thought about Eleanor, about what she would have said. She had always been better than me at holding two true things at once: that Marcus was capable of this, and that he was still someone she had loved. I had needed 6 weeks of evidence to arrive at a conclusion she probably would have reached in a conversation. I was an engineer. I needed the load calculations before I trusted the structure. The phone rang, Claire's name on the screen. "Ethan wants to ask you something," she said when I answered. "He's been working up to it for 2 days. I told him just to call, but..." A pause, and I could hear the smile in her voice, tentative but real. "He wanted to make sure you weren't busy." "I'm not busy," I said. A rustling. Then Ethan's voice, careful and precise, the voice he used when he had rehearsed something. "Grandpa, I was wondering, and you don't have to say yes, but could you teach me how to read engineering drawings, like the ones you make at work?" My chest tightened in the way it did now, when something surprised me by being good. "Yes," I said. "I absolutely can." "Okay." A beat. I could hear him exhale the breath of a child who has been holding something and has finally put it down. "Thank you, Grandpa." After I hung up, I stood in the kitchen for a while, with the phone in my hand and the sandwich half-eaten on the counter and the oak tree going dark outside as the evening came in. I thought about a boy who had been taught to keep a bag packed by the door, who had carried a toy car across 17 cities without knowing what was inside it, who had just asked in a voice he had practiced for 2 days whether his grandfather might have time to teach him something. I put the phone in my pocket. Saturday, I thought. Saturday I would drive to Westchester, and we would sit at Thomas's kitchen table with paper and pencils, and I would show Ethan how to read the invisible lines that tell you where the weight goes. Ethan was already at the kitchen table when I arrived, sitting very straight, with a freshly sharpened pencil and 3 sheets of blank paper lined up with a precision that made me smile before I had even taken off my coat. Thomas had left a pot of coffee on the counter, and a note that said, "Simply gone fishing back by 4, which was Thomas's way of giving us the house without making it a thing. I sat across from Ethan and unrolled the small set of drawings I had brought, simple ones, a floor plan, and a basic structural cross-section, the kind of thing I used to explain to new hires on their first week. Ethan looked at them the way certain children look at things they have decided to take seriously, with a focused, unhurried attention that reminded me so precisely of Claire that it made my chest ache briefly before settling. "Okay," I said. "First thing, what do you see?" Ethan studied the cross-section. "Lines," he said. "A lot of lines. Some are darker than others." "Good. The darker ones are load-bearing walls. They carry the weight of everything above them." I tapped the drawing. "The lighter lines are partition walls. They define space, but they don't hold anything up." I paused. "Can you tell the difference just by looking?" Ethan looked for a long moment. Then he pointed to a thick, dark line running vertically through the center of the drawing. "That one, exactly right," I said. He looked up at me with an expression that was not quite pride, but was adjacent to it, the expression of a child who has gotten something correct and is surprised to find that it feels as good as it does. We worked for nearly 2 hours. Ethan learned the symbol for a door swing and the symbol for a window. He learned that dimensions on a drawing are always the actual measurement, never the drawn size. He learned that the number in the corner of each sheet tells you where that sheet fits in the larger set, so you can never read one page without knowing it belongs to something bigger. He was quick. He asked questions that went one step further than I expected, the way good engineers do not. Just, what does this mean? But why does it work this way? And what happens if it doesn't? "You're good at this," I told him. Ethan looked down at his paper, where he had been copying symbols carefully. "Mom taught me to be careful with details," he said. "She said details are how you know if something is real or not."
I did not say anything to that. I simply looked at my grandson for a moment and thought about Claire sitting in 17 different rented rooms, writing things down in a green notebook, and thought about what it had cost her to raise a child with that kind of precision, while everything around them was deliberately made uncertain. When we finished, Ethan gathered his papers into a neat stack and asked if he could keep the drawings I had brought. I told him they were his. He carried them down the hallway to the guest room, and I stood up to get my coat. That was when I saw it. By the door of the guest room, not inside, but just outside. In the hallway, placed against the baseboard, where it would be the first thing grabbed on the way out, was a small backpack. Dark blue, worn at the straps, the kind designed for a child several years younger than Ethan was now. It was packed. I could tell by the shape of it, the way it sat with a slight forward lean, everything inside arranged to fit. I stood in the hallway and looked at that backpack for a long time. Ethan came back out of the room and saw me looking at it. He did not seem surprised or embarrassed. He simply looked at it the way you look at something so familiar it has stopped registering as unusual. "Mom taught me to keep it ready," he said. His voice was matter of fact, the tone of someone explaining a rule they have followed for so long they no longer remember learning it. In case we needed to go fast. My throat closed. I turned away from the backpack and looked at the window at the end of the hallway at the April afternoon. Outside at the maple trees Thomas had in his yard that were fully leafed now and moving slightly in a wind I could not feel from inside the house. I pressed 2 fingers hard against the bridge of my nose and breathed through it. Ethan's hand appeared at the edge of my vision, small and uncertain, and rested briefly on my arm. "Grandpa," he said, "are you okay?" I lowered my hand, turned back. He was looking up at me with those careful, serious eyes that had seen too much for 10 years old, and were still somehow not defeated by any of it. "I'm okay," I said. "I just needed a second." He nodded, accepting this with the gravity of a child who understood that adults sometimes needed seconds and went to the kitchen to get a glass of water. I picked up my coat from the chair. Claire was in the sitting room, actually reading this time. I could tell, because she looked up with the slightly disoriented expression of someone pulled out of something they had genuinely been inside. She marked her page and set the book down. "How did he do?" she asked. "He's going to be an engineer," I said. "If he wants to be." Something moved across her face, warmth and sorrow. Together the particular combination that comes from being given something good and being aware simultaneously of how much was lost before it arrived. "He's been talking about it since you called," she said. "He drew bridge cross-sections on a paper bag at dinner. Thomas framed it." She shook her head slightly. "He framed it Henry. He put it on the wall." I laughed, a real one, the kind that comes up before you have decided to allow it. Claire looked at me when it happened, and then she laughed too short and surprised, like her own laughter had caught her off guard. We sat for a while in the afternoon quiet of Thomas's sitting room. The light through the window was the long, level light of late April, the kind that makes everything look considered and still. "He keeps the backpack packed," I said. Claire's smile faded. She looked at her hands in her lap. "I know," she said. "I told him he doesn't have to anymore." A pause. "He hasn't unpacked it yet." "He will," I said. "Give him time." She looked up at me. Her eyes were steady and tired, and something else, something I had not seen in them until recently, something tentative and careful that I thought might be the earliest possible version of trust. "I'm going to bring him to the diner," I said. "Saturday, Greystone, Sophie too. I want all 4 of us to sit at that table." I held her gaze. "He should have a Saturday morning that has nothing to do with running." Claire pressed her lips together. Her eyes filled, but she did not look away, and she did not let the tears come. She just held them there, bright and visible, and nodded. "Saturday," she said. Outside, one of the maples moved in the April wind, its leaves catching the afternoon light and holding it briefly before letting it go. The Saturday morning that followed was the kind that arrives without announcement and without drama, just light coming through a window at a familiar angle, coffee brewing in a familiar kitchen, the ordinary machinery of a day that does not yet know it is going to matter. I picked up Sophie first at Ellen's house in Park Slope. Sophie came down the front steps in a yellow jacket, with her hair still damp from the shower, already talking about whether Greystone had added anything new to the menu, because she had heard from a friend that they were doing a seasonal special with strawberries, and she had opinions about whether strawberries belonged on pancakes. "What are your thoughts?" she asked me very seriously, buckling her seatbelt. "I think strawberries are fine on their own," I said, They don't need to complicate the pancakes. That's a very conservative position, Grandpa. I'm 67, I said. I've earned it. She considered this and seemed to find it acceptable. We drove to Westchester to collect Claire and Ethan. Ethan was waiting on Thomas's front porch when we pulled up, sitting on the top step with his hands on his knees. And when he saw the car, he stood up immediately and then deliberately sat back down. I understood the gesture without needing it explained. He was practicing not being ready to run. Claire came out a moment later, pulling on her coat. She saw me watching Ethan, and her mouth did something complicated, a smile that knew too much about itself to be simple. The four of us drove back to Brooklyn together. Sophie and Ethan occupied the back seat with the particular focused energy of two 10-year-olds who have decided they are friends and are engaged in a conversation about something I could not entirely follow, something involving a book series Sophie was reading, and whether the third volume was better than the second, a debate Ethan was participating in, despite not having read either. Claire sat in the passenger seat and looked out the window at the highway and did not say much and did not need to. There was a quality to her silence, and I am aware that the word silence requires qualification. Here, it was not absence but presence, the particular quality of a person who is simply allowing themselves to be somewhere without calculating the exit. Greystone Diner looked exactly as it always had. The same worn wooden booths, the same fog on the windows from the warmth inside, pressing against the morning cold. Becca at the counter, name tag slightly askew, coffee already moving. The smell of bacon and toast, and something sweet I could not identify, the ambient sound of plates and voices and a Saturday morning, arranging itself without effort. We sat at the table by the window. The same table. I sat facing Ethan, not with my back to him, facing him across the small expanse of worn tabletop, in the same chair where I had sat 6 weeks ago, looking at the backs of his shoulders without knowing he was there. Sophie picked up the menu and immediately began investigating the seasonal special. Ethan picked up his menu and held it in both hands and studied it with the careful, methodical attention he brought to everything. And then he looked up across the table and past my shoulder at the booths along the far wall, and something shifted in his expression. A recognition, I thought, of the space, of what it had been the last time he was here, and what it was now. Becca arrived with her notepad and her practiced smile. "What can I get you all this morning?" Sophie immediately launched into a question about the strawberry special. Becca answered with patience. Claire ordered coffee and the egg white omelet, a choice that struck me as the choice of a person who is beginning to think about the future in a practical way, about things like health and time, which requires a certain baseline of safety before it becomes possible. Becca turned to Ethan. He looked at his menu. Then, and I saw it happen, saw the exact moment the old habit reasserted itself. He looked at Claire, the quick sideways glance of a child checking whether the thing he wants is something they can afford, whether wanting it is safe. 3 years of that reflex do not disappear because the circumstances have changed. The body remembers what the mind is still trying to update. Claire met his eyes and smiled, not a reassuring smile, something quieter than that. A smile that said simply, "It's all right. Go ahead." Ethan looked back at his menu. "Grandpa," he said. His voice was careful, the voice he used when he was not entirely certain of the ground beneath him. "Can I really order anything I want?" I looked at this boy across the table, at the serious dark eyes and the slight furrow between his brows and the hands holding the menu with an attention it did not require, at the 10-year-old who had carried a toy car across 17 cities and sat in this diner 6 weeks ago with a glass of water and the trained composure of a child who had learned that wanting things out loud was not always safe. I thought about the backpack by the door, about the green notebook full of dates and addresses, about an envelope taken from a mailbox on a winter afternoon 3 years ago, and all the years of silence that had followed from that single act. I thought about Sophie 6 weeks ago, looking over my shoulder and asking a simple question that a child asks when they notice something that does not make sense. And I thought about what it means to be given a second chance at something you did not know until it was almost too late that you had gotten wrong. "Ethan," I said, "order whatever you want. Order everything on the menu if you like. We have nowhere to be and nothing to do except sit here and eat breakfast together on a Saturday morning. That is the entire plan." Something released in his face. Not dramatically, Ethan did not do things dramatically, just a slight easing around the eyes, a fractional softening of the set of his jaw, the specific physical expression of a child, deciding carefully and with full awareness of the decision to believe that something good is actually happening. "Pancakes," he said, "and scrambled eggs and hot chocolate." "Done," I said. Sophie looked up from her menu with the expression of someone who has just realized an opportunity exists. "I want hot chocolate too," she announced. "You were going to have orange juice," Claire said. "I've changed my position," Sophie said. Claire looked at me. I looked at Claire. The laugh that came out of both of us at the same moment was the kind that surprises itself, unplanned, unpracticed, real. Becca wrote everything down with the patient efficiency of someone who had taken 10,000 breakfast orders and found them all equally worthy of care, and went to the kitchen. The four of us settled. Sophie showed Ethan something on the paper placemat, a drawing she was making a horse. She explained, though, it required explanation. Ethan studied it seriously and offered a critique that was both accurate and kind, which was more than most adults managed. Claire wrapped both hands around her coffee and looked out the window at the Brooklyn street, coming awake outside, at the Saturday morning, people with their dogs and their strollers and their coffee cups, all of them going somewhere or coming from somewhere, with the uncomplicated momentum of people who feel entitled to be exactly where they are. I watched her watching them. Her shoulders were down, not pulled back and braced, not slightly elevated, with the permanent readiness of someone who has learned to expect interruption. Just down. Resting where they were supposed to rest at the end of a long time of not being able to. The food arrived in stages. Ethan's pancakes came first, and he looked at them. For a moment, really looked the way you look at something you have been wanting for long enough that seeing it in front of you requires a beat of adjustment. And then he picked up his fork and ate. Not quickly, not the desperate accelerating pace of the first morning, the pace of a child eating before the plate could be taken away. Slowly. With the unhurried attention of someone who has been told and has begun carefully, and with appropriate skepticism, to believe that the plate is not going anywhere. I drank my coffee. The morning light came through the window, at the angle it always came through at Greystone, on a Saturday in April, across the worn tabletop, and the water glasses and the small ceramic creamer that was always slightly too full. Nothing about the diner had changed. Everything else had. I had spent 40 years building structures meant to hold weight, and I had believed without examining the belief that the most important thing I had built was the company, the contracts, the projects, the infrastructure that would outlast me in steel and concrete and load-bearing walls. I had been wrong about that, or not wrong exactly, incomplete. The way an engineer is incomplete when he calculates the load without accounting for the ground beneath the foundation. The most important thing I had built was sitting at this table. It was a woman who had kept a green notebook for 3 years because she believed, in spite of all available evidence, that the truth was worth recording. It was a boy who had carried a toy car across 17 cities and sat down in this diner 6 weeks ago with nothing but a glass of water and the dignity of a child who had been taught even in the middle of uncertainty to say please and thank you. It was a 10-year-old girl who had looked over her grandfather's shoulder one Saturday morning and asked a question that nobody else had thought to ask. And it was me, 67 years old, still capable, it turned out, of learning something new about where the weight actually goes. Ethan looked up from his pancakes and found me watching him. He did not look away. He met my eyes with the direct, unguarded gaze of a child who has decided for now that the person looking at him can be trusted. "Grandpa," he said, "these are really good pancakes." "They are," I agreed. "We should come back." "Every Saturday," I said, "if you want." He considered this with the gravity he brought to all important questions. Then he nodded once decisively in the manner of someone finalizing a contract. "Okay," he said, "every Saturday." Outside, Brooklyn went on being Brooklyn. The light moved the way light moves in April, slowly and with intention, and the morning arranged itself around 4 people sitting at a table by the window, eating breakfast, going nowhere, needing nothing else. I spent 67 years building things meant to last. But the most important structure I ever neglected was trust, and the most costly mistake I ever made was choosing comfort over truth. This is a family story that nearly destroyed everything I loved. A family betrayal I helped survive, simply by refusing to ask one honest question for 3 years. Do not be the person I was. When something feels wrong, ask. When someone is hurting, look. Every family betrayal leaves someone waiting in silence, hoping one person will finally turn around. I believe God puts the right moment in front of us when we are ready. Mine arrived in a diner through a child's innocent question. Yours may arrive differently, but it will come if you are willing to see it. My personal truth, after everything loyalty without honesty, is not love. It is fear wearing a familiar face. If this family story touched something in, you drop a comment below. I want to hear which moment stayed with you. Share this with someone who needs it and subscribe to stay close for what comes next. Thank you deeply for walking this journey all the way to the end. Stories on this channel include fictional elements crafted purely for reflection and meaningful storytelling. If this style of content isn't right for you, please feel free to find something that fits your heart better, and know that is perfectly okay.